countries. So by way of closing, I want to quote somebody that I have huge admiration for. It could be Nick's turn, but it won't be you, Nick, today. I want to quote Sir David Attenborough. And he said, "If working apart we are a force powerful enough to destabilize our planet, surely working together we are powerful enough to save it." Well, let us all demonstrate it, whoever we are, wherever we are, whatever our mandate, that of course we comply with. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, and for a 30 years climate geek I am, it's really interesting to see that a hero is a central banker now. So last but not least, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, the incoming presidency of the COP28. The floor is yours now. I cannot just, you have an enormous task, and you seem happy and calm and decided just to deliver. And you have seen how much is on your shoulders. And anyway, on the side, thank you for, together with a complot with Ngozi, to have put trade in the core of the COP28. It will make a big, big difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurent. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it indeed gives me great pleasure to be back here in Paris, in the city that brought the world together around a common vision for real and true climate progress back in 2015, 7 years ago. In fact, that was a moment of historic unity to address a global problem that affects us all, with no exceptions. But in the years since, it has been very unfortunate that we have seen that spirit of solidarity fall away. And I repeat, very unfortunately. And we have seen the gap widen between North and South, particularly when it comes to climate finance. So allow me to start by first communicating how appreciative we are of the trust that has been given to the United Arab Emirates to host this very important and significant COP28 in 2023. And I must also recognize the leadership of President Emmanuel Macron for bringing the world together again. In fact, taking the bull by the horns and pushing for a new deal to level the financial playing field. We highly appreciate your efforts, sir. It has been clear for some time that there is a mismatch between the size of the climate challenge and the financial resources that are desperately needed to address it. Many voices have raised the alarm, but few have cut through the noise like Mia Mottley. Her words yesterday did in fact resonate with me when she said the world needs to bring pace and scope to the problem. She said IFI reforms was not enough and can't be the only track we pursue. She in fact said what we need is transformation, and that is a mirror image of our approach and plan at COP28, a transformational progress rather than incremental steps forward. I believe she was very right in her statement yesterday. Over the course of this summit, I must say, I have seen a willingness to move beyond words into action. My good friend AJ Banga yesterday offered to put World Bank debt repayments on hold for countries dealing with climate emergencies. He announced a robust plan to release special drawing rights to vulnerable nations. And donor countries are finally closing in on their promise of the 100 billion in climate finance for the Global South. And I repeat, that must be delivered this year. But let's face it, these are barely band-aids, or I call them painkillers, to a problem that requires major surgery. In fact, what is truly needed is a true surgical intervention to the climate finance problem. For countries that have done the least to cause climate change, climate finance remains unavailable, inaccessible, and not affordable. Changing that equation requires trillions in private investment, not just billions in multilateral loans. The key to attracting more private finance and capital is simply lowering the risk. Radically raising the level of concessional funding is one of the keys to unlocking commercial investment. But we need to bring everyone to the table across the financial committee and use every tool in the shed. Capital markets can do more to enhance the regulatory environment that allows green bonds to finance large-scale infrastructure projects and give investors reliable, sustainable returns. Voluntary carbon markets have the potential to be a powerful enabler in financing mitigation and adaptation efforts in emerging and developing economies. But to maximize their value, standards must be harmonized and transactions transparently must be monitored. And we need to integrate sustainable investing principles into mainstream finance to drive the transition towards a new climate-positive economy. In short, we need to take a comprehensive and a holistic approach to a global challenge. View climate action as an opportunity, not as a burden, and act together with unity of purpose. As the United Arab Emirates prepares to host COP28, we do that with humility, a deep sense of responsibility, and a great understanding of how urgent this matter is. And we do that with a mindset centered around inclusivity, and that is going to be our guiding principle. What makes COP28 significant is the fact that we want to build on all the successes of previous COPs, and in particular, the great success and the progress made at COP27 in Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh. We must build on all of the progress made in the past. But this year, it is the global stocktake, the first assessment whereby we will measure our progress against the Paris Agreement. And I believe everyone have had access to the most recent IPCC report. The science is crystal clear. The world is way off track. It's been 7 years, we have 7 more years, and if we're serious and sincerely keen in helping keep 1.5 within reach, we must work in a comprehensive manner with a holistic approach to reduce emissions by 43% if we're serious of keeping 1.5 within reach. And of course, to do that, I aim to bring everyone together. Those who can contribute, those who are like-minded, those who are practical in their thinking, those who are pragmatic, those who are driven by results and action, and those who will represent every stakeholder with a positive mindset, those who will bring people and organizations and stakeholders spanning governments, private sector, businesses, NGOs, and of course, and critically, the financial community. We know what we are trying to solve, and we know the gaps at hand. And to do that, we must be practical and we must focus on the how. Let's translate our words into real and tangible actions. Let's work in lockstep towards our common goal. Climate change sees no division between North and South. It is a global problem and it requires a true global solution. It does not discriminate between peoples or countries. It is a global challenge that will require a global response from everyone working together only in unity and solidarity. If we act in true unity, we can apply pace and scope to deliver action and hope. I thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sultan. You had made a beautiful closure. As I stand here, 7 years after Paris Agreement, I can see how much hope I have, but how much and high my demand is towards everyone here in the room. We cannot miss the opportunity, as you said. And everyone is wanting government, companies, local authorities, just to deliver. So you have that in your hands. We will be looking, of course, at you with hope and resolve. But this Paris momentum, which I hope will be the case, has to really evolve into really a precise roadmap. So accountability, seriousness, and deliver. And so the baton is for you now. Thank you all. It was very...
Mesdames et messieurs, vous serez reconnaissants de bien vouloir regagner vos places. Mesdames et messieurs les chefs d'État, nous vous serions reconnaissants de bien vouloir vous lever. Nous allons procéder à la photographie de famille. 1, 2, 3. Merci, mesdames, messieurs les chefs d'État. Merci de regagner vos places, s'il vous plaît. Avant de reprendre vos travaux, nous avons le plaisir de pouvoir vous montrer quelques moments forts de la journée d'hier, la journée de vos débats, de vos tables rondes, de vos conversations qui ont eu lieu ici même, mais également à l'OCDE et à l'UNESCO, nos deux institutions partenaires de ce sommet. Bon film.
C'est un honneur pour nous d'accueillir ce sommet pour un nouveau pacte financier mondial.
As you are considering a new finance pact, let's put people above profit.
And Emmanuel, I've left you for last because privately I call this the How Dare You Summit. How dare you? How dare you upset the order? How dare you step out of your crease and summon us all to this inflection moment? There is now the beginning of the understanding that poverty and climate cannot be separated, that education and climate cannot be separated.
En 2023, plus de 750 millions de personnes ne mangent pas à leur faim. Et des dizaines de millions de personnes supplémentaires sont en train de basculer dans l'extrême pauvreté.
For Kenya, for example, we pay $10 billion every year to service our debts. If I had $10 billion every year for development in Kenya, instead of paying debt, it would make a huge difference.
Les propositions qui nous ont été données, c'était des maturités de crédit faibles, des taux d'intérêt élevés, 12%. Il a fallu qu'on donne des garanties personnelles. Dans des cas comme ça, nous donnons des garanties immobilières. C'est-à-dire, si le projet ne marche pas, on est mis dehors.
Il y a 4 éléments très simples que je voulais poser en début de cette conférence. D'abord, le premier principe, c'est que jamais aucun décideur, aucun pays ne doit avoir à choisir entre la réduction de la pauvreté et la protection de la planète. Deuxième principe, chaque pays doit choisir souverainement son chemin. Troisième principe, nous devons assumer un choc de financement public. Et puis le quatrième principe, c'est qu'on a besoin de beaucoup plus de secteur privé.
Our job is to eliminate poverty, but on a livable planet. Today, we are announcing a comprehensive approach that significantly expands the World Bank's toolkit for crisis preparedness, response, and recovery.
This is my announcement. We have reached 100 billion on lending of SDRs. That was our target from 21. We have achieved that target.
Unless and until we come out with a fair, equitable, and judicious formula of distribution of resources, financial resources, this world will never live in peace.
I am pleased that the principle of solidarity expressed in Hiroshima resonates at this summit meeting in Paris.
We argue, and you will know strongly, that we now need a universal vulnerability index. We've had 100 years to do this. We now have 10.
Notre défi est de développer des marchés de crédit pour la biodiversité qui peuvent soutenir les peuples et la planète.
Now we have concessional for vulnerable middle income.
I'm determined that we do it by giving them quality of life and giving them jobs, because it is the best way to drive a nail into the coffin of poverty. That's the only way.
That we'll be announcing $50 million in new investments for the Blue Orchard Latin American Caribbean Gender Diversity and Inclusion Fund.
MDBs are leveraging machines. So let me end here with a call for us, the MDBs, to work together to scale this type of instrument, which is a very pragmatic, palpable thing to do.
But I think it's really important to know that nature and climate are not two separate things. Mother Nature, Mother Earth didn't create all this list of acronyms. It doesn't recognize them. It sees nature, including climate, as one ecosystem.
So we're actually thinking about how do those who are impacted and affected by crisis play a bigger role in actually determining the types of funding they need and the locations that it needs to go to.
Les trois sujets, écologie, sociale et démocratie, sont trois sujets intimement liés si on veut avoir des solutions efficaces.
We are saying we want one that does not bring the baggage and the toxic conversation of North versus South. We do not want a conversation that is going to take us to developing versus developed, emitters versus non-emitters. No.
We find the performance of bank accounts where women have been given assistance are actually doing very well. They never become non-performing assets.
So in all these systems of architecture, we're not just now talking about the needs on climate and the needs on development, but how do you pull women in, not just to the conversation, but to change policies?
Nous allons signer aujourd'hui, en tout cas nous venons d'avoir un accord avec le G7 à travers le JETP, Just Energy for Transition, où le Sénégal s'est engagé à monter à 40% d'énergie renouvelable à l'horizon 2030.
So by and large, the message from the African continent is now clear. We're on board, okay? We want to join the international community. We don't want Africa to be left behind.
For us to be successful in what President Macron wants to do here, we have to have regulators in the room. So here we are, touché.
We are determined to engage with all stakeholders and all market participants to make sure that private capital can be mobilized to fund low-income countries and especially to support them in the energy transition.
In the Global South, we have a lot of money available, and in the Global South, we have a lot of projects which need finance. So it's our goal is to bring together those two parties, right?
So let's be imaginative. Let's build a task force that can look at all these financial possibilities, these sources, whether it is a tax on transaction, on the financial transaction.
Let us agree to pay the aviation tax. We have no problem. Let us agree on the shipping tax, and we want to pay. We don't want anybody to pay for us. We want to pay our percentage.
I wanted to propose is that we look at global carbon pricing, because that could, of course, generate much, much more funding. Only 4%, only 4%. It's almost nothing. But these 4% have already generated last year $55 billion.
Voy a poner el Fondo de Clima como institución, que ha sido hasta ahora raquítico. Unos ingresos adicionales que tendrían que salir como una taxación a las transacciones financieras mundiales.
In March in Gabon, we had the pleasure of joining President Macron, the Rob Walton Foundation, in announcing a seed fund of $100 million just to get started, to jumpstart this process.
Il faut donc faire profiter des pays comme le Niger des instruments de garantie de financement auxquels nous pouvons prétendre et réduire les primes de risque excessives.
Les prochains mois qui seront marqués par des rendez-vous internationaux à l'occasion, pas simplement d'être d'accord sur un constat, mais sur des actions à entreprendre pour tenter de modifier la manière dont on se comporte, la manière dont on agit.
So my expectation is that we will agree in Paris and we will conclude in Nairobi.
The people of the world are watching what you do here. Please remember the people, we, the people.
Monsieur le Président de la République,
Mr. President,
merci beaucoup.
thank you very much.
Et bonjour à toutes et tous.
Good
Merci
morning
d'être
to
là.
everyone. Thank you for being
d'abord,
here.
on va donner les canaux de traduction.
First of all, we'll announce the interpretation channels. I have a very practical turn of mind. Channel 1 is what? French 1, English 2. Please check. I know that Portuguese is 6 for President Lula. French 1, English 2. Does everyone have the interpretation that they need? Is this working? Do you have Portuguese on channel 6? Spanish 3? Arabic 4, Chinese 5. So you need 6. Are you hearing Portuguese? Is this all good? Does President Lula have interpretation in Portuguese? Could someone come? Is everyone getting the proper interpretation or not? You have Portuguese as well? I think we can say that people who need Portuguese are not hearing it. Let's just check that before we get started. Otherwise, can you hear? English, you've got English. 2, channel 2. Who is having problems with the interpretation? Guinea-Bissau, Brazil, and Kenya. Yes, I've understood. Kenya also. Everything is working, Mr. President. Is that okay? No, but I'm testing now. Is everything coming through now? Does President Lula have Portuguese? It would be a good thing for someone to step up here. Otherwise, this may take a while. Mr. President, if there are 3 presidents, including my neighbor who can't hear, I'm not going to start. I'm not going to preach in the desert. There's someone who has a lot of power on us now. That is the people who understand how the interpretation works. And if one of those people could possibly come and see why these 3 headsets are not working, that would allow us to save a lot of precious time. That's how we solve the most complicated problems. Is this working? Is this working? You can start, Mr. President. Thank you all very much. There we go, a first collective achievement. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Our goal is not to have a series of speeches. This final session, rather, is meant to be an expression of our convictions. And I will sit down so that I won't give everybody the temptation to take the floor one after the other standing up. Our idea is to go over the discussions that we had yesterday on all the different working groups between heads of state and government, heads of international organizations, and I thank them for participating in the working dinner yesterday, who are trying to come up with a new shared consensus. During this summit, there were some very concrete things that we did. We had the 100 billion for climate financing that was finalized, another 100 billion for reallocation of special drawing rights that were promised in 2021. And I congratulate everyone who finalized those agreements here. We finalized a new fund for forests and nature ahead of COP28 that is meant to be doing roughly the same thing. That is to say, having the initiatives to preserve biodiversity and the revenues that they do be earmarked for them. We had initiatives for Zambia, and we had the conclusion for the just energy transition for Senegal as well. I'd also like to thank all of those who took part in those agreements. I won't go on at greater length, but there's a long list of other concrete objects. I think we can also say we finalized the shared roadmap, and I'd like to thank everyone who took part in that, and especially leaders of the World Bank and the IMF. This is a highly structuring element for the transformation of our landscape, with better coordination of the work that's done, new ambitions, and a new lever with the private sector that is of key importance. So what we want to do with all of this, with these initial elements, is to build a new consensus that we share. A consensus which is a method and which has been built by and for the whole planet. The poorest countries, developing countries, middle-income countries, the big emerging players, and the richest countries. And many countries that were not around the table. When the Bretton Woods institutions were invented, at a time when we weren't playing for the same stakes in terms of poverty, and when the issue of climate and biodiversity was not part of our debate. We have to say all of these things. So the agenda that we are now setting forth with this method is very important. And the goal we need to set ourselves is to try in a very simple way to have a form of political commitment that comes out of these debates that we've just had. Not legally binding, if I can say that, but which will describe a consensus on the basis of which, in months to come, from Nairobi to the G20 in India, with the COP28 and the Italian G7 and the Brazilian G20 will be able to continue pursuing this agenda and crystallizing it with more binding documents. But here today we can say we all agree on the same things. And with some very simple elements. First of all, we agree that we don't have the right to choose between these agendas. We have to do things at the same time. We have to fight against inequality and poverty. We have to fight against or prevent climate change and reduce our emissions. We have to deal with the consequences of climate vulnerability, and we have to succeed at engaging with biodiversity. And that's why we have to integrate these different things in our debt criteria. For instance, the climate aspect, that's the Bridgetown agenda. We need to integrate new forms of financing for nature, and why we have to have properly adapted contracts for each country, so as to be able to deal with all of these issues. The second consensual element, and that's a bit what we're doing with preserving forests and nature, for energy as well, we want to have an approach which is done country by country, because the models are so very different that at the end of the day, our international institutions, what we end up doing is to create means, but we don't really allow things to happen on a country by country basis, as many people correctly recalled yesterday. And it's a bit the same thing we've done for energy that we now want to do for biodiversity and elsewhere as well. A third element, we all assume there's going to be a shock in public finance, which will be a considerable size, to finance education and health and economic opportunity and climate change all at the same time. And in order to do this, we need to transform our institutions. First of all, by accepting that we will invest more in them, and secondly, in optimizing the way they work. And I think there are three things that flow from our debate here. One, a new roadmap between the World Bank and the IMF that I mentioned, that's of key importance, and that will allow us to improve the way things work. Secondly, better functioning of public banks, and that came yesterday from our Finance in Common sequence. We are going to put all the public development banks together with our multilateral structures and work together to avoid overlap and to have more leverage between our financial institutions and our public banks, whether they be regional or subject-based. Then thirdly, and this is of absolutely fundamental importance, we need to make parallel commitments to a reform of our financial institutions. I think several people said that. We have to say that as well. The G77 talked about this at length, so did many of the big emerging players, to have more adapted forms of government in today's world. And because we want to avoid a fracturing of these institutions, we need to adapt their governance methods and to work on in-depth reform of them to make them fairer, more representative of who we are and of the status quo we have today. And we need to do this. I'd add something else. There was a lot of discussion above and beyond what countries are doing and institutions are doing, the idea of international taxation. And this was said by many different people to talk about a tax on financial contributions, on maritime transport, on some other modes. And this will only work if it's truly international. And that presupposes an agreement, just as we had on minimal taxation in the context with a broad OECD, which is a very useful platform here, so as to finalize consensus and agreements in this area. And then there were also many things which led us to the conclusion that as we are moving along this path, we need to mobilize much more private finance. There's a huge amount of private finance, as we saw yesterday, with sovereign funds, with private equity asset managers, but there's not enough being done with emerging countries, middle-income countries, and even poor countries. And so what we need to do is to finalize mechanisms. A lot of work has been done these last years to guarantee the risks that are taken on the first loss, so as then to trigger much more private financing. And this is work we need to do. The World Bank committed itself yesterday to a one-for-one lever. They're much more ambitious than I, but if we put €1 or $1 of public funding, then we should get at least 1 unit of private finance as well. And our banks here as well, our regional banks, are working on an agenda which will allow them to do the same thing. And we will need to mobilize and to share the needs in the countries concerned by this mobilization. That is what I wanted to recapitulate from our work. And this is starting to be the terms of a new consensus with new instruments, much more money, new methodologies, but also a path toward an in-depth governance reform, which we so greatly need. So I'd also like the panelists who are here to conclude. We'll be able to go over the subjects of importance to them at some length. I'll start with the Prime Minister of China. Your country has shown its commitment to invest in development and at the same time also the protection of the planet, for instance, with the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal framework on biodiversity. To your way of thinking, how can those two goals be made to work together, and how can this agenda be brought together so that our co-citizens and our planet may benefit from this? You have the floor.
Your Excellency President Emmanuel Macron, Your Excellencies, heads of state, government, and international organizations, distinguished colleagues, guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It gives me great pleasure to join you in Paris to attend the summit for a new global finance impact, which is launched at personal initiative of President Emmanuel Macron. The summit is highly relevant as it focuses on the pressing tasks in global development and confronts issues of shared concern in the current situation. First of all, on behalf of the Chinese government, I wish to express sincere appreciation to President Macron and the French government for putting together the summit and for your thoughtful arrangements. The Chinese government attaches high importance to global development and governance. President Xi Jinping has, in recent years, proposed the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. They have been well received by the international community and are being translated into concrete actions. China's propositions on global development are not only ideas that China contributes to the international community, but also a reflection of China's own course of development. First, as an important engine of the world economy, China has injected sustained impetus into global growth. In the past decade, as many of you know, with a steady some 30% contribution to global growth, China has been an anchor and a driver of the world economy. This year, the Chinese economy has shown an upward momentum. GDP growth in the first quarter was 4.5%, and this figure was among the highest in major economies. The country enjoys a distinct strength in its mega-sized market and well-developed industrial system. The fundamentals underpinning its long-term growth are as strong as ever. For the world, China's development is not a threat, but a big opportunity. No matter how the international environment may evolve, China will remain steadfast in pursuing reform and opening up, pursuing high-quality development, and aligning with high-standard international economic and trade rules. All countries are welcome to share the opportunities brought by China's development. Second, as a responsible major country, China has made enormous efforts to tackle climate change. Ancient philosophies such as unity of man and nature and deference to the nature are deeply ingrained in the Chinese civilization. Guided by the vision of man and nature living together in harmony, we have adopted a national strategy of meeting the climate challenge, stepped up efforts to adjust and improve the industrial structure and energy mix, and advocated green and low-carbon ways of life and production. Over the past decade, China sustained an average 6.2% annual growth, with just 3% growth in energy consumption. China's carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP dropped by around 35%, and the share of coal in energy consumption went down by around 12%. In terms of installed capacity of wind, solar, and other green energies, China is the world's biggest country, and we have the highest output and sales of new energy vehicles. China honors its commitments with concrete actions. We conscientiously fulfill our obligations under the UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement, and have been working hard to realize carbon peaking before 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060. We wish to work with all countries to advance green, low-carbon, and sustainable development. And China is ready to join the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People initiated by France and other countries. Third, as a contributor to global development, China has provided a strong boost to global poverty reduction and development. Ending poverty is an ideal shared by all. In the past decade, we fought and won the biggest battle against poverty in human history. Nearly 100 million Chinese were lifted out of poverty, and the problem of absolute poverty, which long haunted our nation, was resolved once and for all. This is a major contribution to the global endeavor of poverty reduction. Meanwhile, China is deeply engaged in global poverty reduction cooperation under the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative for the poorest countries. China has provided more debt relief than any other member, which accounts for over 40% of the total debt deferred. As the Chinese saying goes, one man alone can hardly carry a heavy load, but many men working together can move mountains. The world now faces a yawning gap in development financing. As the largest developing country, China wishes to make an appeal for sincere cooperation and concerted actions to jointly tackle the difficulties confronting the developing world, especially the vulnerable countries. In this connection, I propose that we take the following steps.
First, we should be resolute in advancing global financial governance reform to foster a stable financing environment for developing countries. China is ready to work with all parties to make global financial governance equitable and efficient, to provide developing countries with a more friendly international financing environment. Meanwhile, we need to improve the global financial safety net and step up international coordination on macroeconomic policies to mitigate negative spillover effects. International financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank should also follow through on the consensus reached by the G20 leaders and complete the new round of quota and voting power reforms to increase the say of emerging markets and developing countries. Second, we should be resolute in fostering a global development partnership to mobilize more development resources for developing countries. The international community needs to forge a high-quality global development partnership that is united, equal, balanced, inclusive, and mobilize developed countries, development aid institutions, the private sector, non-profit foundations, and other parties to scale up inputs of development resources, including funding and technology. Developed countries should fulfill their primary responsibility in development financing and honor their assistance and funding commitments to developing countries. Developing countries, on their part, need to press ahead with related reforms, fully utilize resources, and build up their own capacity for development. On climate change, developed countries should face up to their historical responsibility and take credible steps to increase funding support to developing countries in line with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. They should make good on their promise to mobilize $100 billion in climate finance and double the size of adaptation finance as soon as possible, with public funding as the mainstay, and set the new collective quantified goal on climate finance post-2025. China will continue to take practical steps and do its best to provide support of various forms to fellow developing countries. China is ready to work with all parties, including international financial institutions and commercial creditors, to be engaged actively in the debt relief efforts to resolve the issue in an effective, holistic, and comprehensive manner, in keeping with the principle of joint actions and fair burden sharing. Third, we should be resolute in pushing forward with economic globalization and free trade to generate new momentum of growth for developing countries. China will join international efforts to create an open environment conducive to development, promote trade and investment liberalization and facilitation, unequivocally reject trade protectionism and all forms of decoupling and severing supply chains, and keep global industrial and supply chains safe and stable. Meanwhile, we need to boost industrial and investment cooperation, encourage multinationals and large businesses to make more direct investment in developing countries, and help developing countries involve deeper in global industrial division of labor and cooperation to expand development space and strengthen the momentum of growth. As we mark the 20th anniversary of the China-EU Comprehensive Strategic Partnership this year, China-Europe relations are at a new starting point. The Chinese culture believes in seeking common ground while reserving differences and working together for the common good. In a world fraught with disputes and uncertainties, China and Europe should rise above differences, seek and expand common ground while reserving and narrowing differences, and push for more creative cooperation to tackle the uncertainty in the global situation with the stability of our relations and jointly contribute to sustainable development in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, humanity is one family living in the same global village. On the journey of development, no one should be left behind. Let us work together with a sense of common purpose and the spirit of solidarity to accelerate the building of a community with a shared future for mankind and jointly make the world a better place for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I have a request for a reaction from President Akufo-Addo, and then I'll give the floor to Ms. Yellen to tell us what she thinks about this aspect of reform.
Thank you very much, President Macron. I just want to make two brief comments. Last year, we were here for another financing conference, and a critical decision that we took last year referred to the expansion of the SDR allocations. And the idea was that the countries of Africa would get a greater share, a greater part of that allocation. That didn't happen. The traditional formula was applied. And I think that what that tells us is that whatever it is that we want to propose here, we need also to dial into the details of those proposals so that we have a realistic chance of having the proposals implemented. The second, finance is a major challenge for the nations of Africa to initiate the adaptation and mitigation measures that are needed to confront the climate crisis. We have large sums of money that are readily available on the continent, which can be brought into play. And I refer to the huge sums of money that are taken out of the continent illicitly. We've been told, ever since Thabo Mbeki's committee, that we're dealing in the order of $100 billion a year annually of monies that are taken out of the continent illegally, illicitly. One can imagine the significance of bringing this money into play. Were we able to plug the loopholes that permit these outflows to take place? What I would suggest is that we recommend that the African Union and the G7 OECD countries establish a working committee to deliberate on this matter and make recommendations for action by the two groups. We can talk about a 3 to 6 month period. A lot of work has already been done in this area, but we need to have a dual approach to how these matters can be resolved. And I believe that if we're able to do that, we would make a tremendous impact on the financial problems that bedevil the African continent. So I would suggest that if there is agreement around this idea, that we find a place in the summit declaration for the idea of this joint working committee. I'd like to end by saying that, like all my colleagues, we want to thank you, President Macron, for bringing us together. We also thank our sister, Mia Motley, for the important part she played in preparing the grounds for this summit. Thank you very much indeed, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. Maybe I'll quickly give the floor to the Director General
sur la question des 100 milliards de réallocation de droits de tirage spéciaux, parce que je pense que c'est utile pour tout le monde de savoir où nous en sommes, qu'est-ce qui a été engagé, qu'est-ce qui est déjà engagé dans des programmes, comment ça marche.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
President.
I want to thank all those countries, developed countries, as well as emerging market economies who have pledged to provide part of their special drawing rights that were allocated in August 2021 so we can lend at highly concessional terms for 20 years with 10.5 years grace period. In other words, provide vital resource to low-income countries as well as to vulnerable middle-income countries. Barbados was one of the first to cross the finish line, and now we have 7 countries, among them Bangladesh, Rwanda, Costa Rica, Seychelles, Kosovo, that have tapped into this financing that was made available. Mr. President, I want to clarify that we have made, through the SDRs, 2 separate decisions. Number 1, provide allocation of $650 billion that was distributed across our membership proportionate to quotas countries hold. Number 2, and that was, I want to remind us, that was in the midst of COVID, when liquidities was short, where countries were desperate for fiscal space. We can only do this because of the strength of 190 members. Those among our members that have that financial strength make it possible to allocate SDRs to everybody. And that allocation at that time lifted up by somewhere between 2 and 6% of GDP fiscal space in countries that are around this table. The second step was a brave decision to on-lend SDRs from countries that got it but don't need it to countries that really badly need it. And at that point, we made a commitment to mobilize 100 billion. That commitment now is fulfilled. We have these pledges, and I want to recognize France and Japan. They provide 40% of their SDRs. Also China provided a pledge of 28% of their new allocation of SDRs. We are making this work, and not only we are making it work, but it works for matters the most, unleashing private finance for climate action. The Barbados case, we have a coalition of development banks, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust of the IMF, that helps provide first loss guarantee, so private capital is mobilized. And Ajay, we are doing it in this particular case. It is indeed 1-to-1, but we have an ambition to learn and do better. The same is in the case of Rwanda. We are mobilizing a coalition of development finance with the Resilience and Sustainability Trust based on work done by the World Bank on what policy should be implemented, that is offering first loss guarantee, mobilizing private finance. So there is a lot of confusion. I admit SDRs is somewhat archaic. Nobody quite knows it, aside of Miss Yellen, who wrote a paper on SDRs, and me, because obviously I'm in charge of the SDR department. But for everybody here, my neighbor, President of Sri Lanka, asked me, Kristalina, why are you doing only 100 billion? Why not 200 billion and 300 billion? My answer is, we are doing something new. It requires protecting the reserve quality status of SDRs, but creating long-term concessional resource for countries. We have to do that prudently. We prove it works. We go from 100 to 200 and then to 300. But I would not rush, because if we undermine the reserve quality status of SDRs by willy-nilly doing something not so good, then we won't see that multiplier impact coming. I hope this clarifies this issue once for all of us. Mr. President, President of Ghana, did it clarify it for you?
Merci beaucoup. Je pense que c'était important.
Thank you very much. I think it was very
les
important
engagements
to
sur
be
les
able
100
to
milliards
say
ont été
that
tenus.
the
Il y
commitment
en a
of
déjà
100
plus de
billion
60
has
qui
been
sont arrivés dans
fulfilled.
les
There's
caisses du
already
FMI,
60 that's come into
10
the
programmes qui ont été lancés,
coffers.
10 autres qui vont être lancés très vite. Donc maintenant,
Programs
ce qu'on
have
va
been
faire, c'est
launted,
aller chercher
10
les
others
40
in the
milliards sur
pipeline. Now we need
les
to
100 qui ont
get the
été
40
engagés
billion out
pour
of the
qu'on ait la
100
totalité du
committed so
programme.
that we
Il faut
have
faire
the
plus. Mais
full
c'était une
program. We
première.
need to do more.
Et en 2 ans, c'est
But
trop
that
lent aussi.
was a first.
Mais on l'a fait.
I think time took us too long, but at least we did it. So we've moved on from the summit 2 years ago. Otherwise, summits are just about talking. I think it's nice to see what we've actually done, which is good transition into the statement by Jensen. Thank you for being with us, because the reform of the international financial system is important, and this agenda of the World Bank and the multilateral banks that you're in charge of. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Can you? Yes. Thank you, President Macron. Thank you for your hospitality, for your leadership. Thank you for bringing us together to discuss how to align our efforts to reduce poverty and also to address climate change and other global challenges. I think it's clear from the summit we do have consensus. We share the goal of securing a more prosperous, healthy, and livable planet. And it's also clear that there's political will and commitment to multilateralism to translate intentions into actions. Indeed, I'm pleased to share this stage with colleagues from around the world, including Premier Li Qiang. As I said in a speech earlier in the year, as the world's 2 largest economies, we have a responsibility to work together on global issues. It's something we can do and something the world expects of us. Last fall, we launched an initiative to evolve the multilateral development banks, and I'd like to focus on that work. We want them to be able to better address global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and fragility and conflict. Now, during this process, we have heard concerns that there must be a trade-off between addressing these challenges and accelerating, focusing on global issues may retard our ability to invest in health, education, or poverty alleviation. Some wonder how the MDBs can do more of one without doing less of the other, given limited resources and capacity. But I strongly believe that's a false choice. The MDBs need to do both, and they need to do both well. And that's because countries can't make sustained progress on poverty eradication and the Sustainable Development Goals if they don't build resilience to global shocks. And if there's one thing that's certain, and we have seen repeatedly, these shocks will surely come. Indeed, global challenges are increasing in scope and complexity. They disproportionately affect the poorest and most vulnerable, and they're intimately intertwined with national challenges. And these are not hypothetical concerns. We see the consequences playing out in very real ways for people all around the world. Climate change is dampening agricultural yields. It's driving food insecurity in many parts of the world. And I saw this on full display when I visited 3 African countries earlier this year. Indeed, the smallhold farmers I visited in Zambia described the toll that extreme weather events and floods are taking on their livelihoods. And they didn't make any distinction between national challenges and global challenges. In addition, threats to global health disrupt entire societies and economies, and the pandemic really led to the first global increase in extreme poverty we've seen in decades. And conflict not only causes immense human suffering, it also stunts economic growth and contributes to significant displacement of people across regions. So these are problems that are not contained within national borders and cannot be solved by countries acting alone. They're fundamentally global problems. And that's why we think it's imperative that we evolve the multilateral development banks to respond to global challenges with speed and with scale. And doing anything less would be a disservice to the rest of the development agenda. The World Bank is in the midst of accelerating progress on the evolution agenda, and President Bonga has spoken at length about this effort. And we already do have tangible, concrete results thanks to this initiative. The World Bank has updated its mission to account for the fact that addressing global challenges is critical to achieving its twin goals of eradicating extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. But in addition, the World Bank is integrating global challenges now into its diagnostic work, its country engagement, and its corporate scorecard. And those organizational changes should help to ingrain work to address these challenges into the World Bank's DNA. And the bank is responsibly stretching its balance sheet and pursuing innovative measures to unlock up to $50 billion in additional lending capacity over the next 10 years. As part of this agenda, we believe that the MDBs as a system could actually unlock $200 billion in new lending capacity over the same time frame through balance sheet measures that are either already under implementation or being deliberated. And we began the Evolution Initiative at the World Bank, but we've always recognized that maximizing its impact requires an evolution across the entire MDB system and beyond to cover the funds. The MDBs are vital multilateral tools to help us face the demands of our changing world, but really they would be more effective if they worked better together as a system, each operating with its relative strengths and expertise, and in concert with others, and also in better partnership, and this is of course important, with the private sector, with civil society, and with philanthropies. And we've discussed during this summit creative ways in which we can bring private capital in and at scale to work cooperatively with public institutions, the MDBs, and others. I believe we have the necessary ingredients to make real progress: political leadership, creativity, innovative financing mechanisms, and the openness and courage to learn from the past, as well as to forge new solutions for the future. With strong collective action across all shareholders, management, and other critical partners like the African Union, we can help meet the aspirations of people around the world, and we need to do this urgently. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
C'est beau, en effet, les 200 milliards
There's
qu'on
no
peut
doubt that
mobiliser à
the
travers
200 billion that can be mobilized
justement les innovations qui ont été décidées et
through
les
the
changements sont
various
très
innovations
structurants. Vous avez
decided in
évoqué à
exchanges.
plusieurs reprises
That's a very
la
important
question de la
number of
résilience face
occasions
au
we
choc,
talked about
et en
resilience to
particulier la
shocks.
question de la
In
vulnérabilité climatique se
particular,
pose.
the climate
Mia Motley a joué un rôle très
vulnerability
important
issue.
autour de cette conférence à travers l'agenda de Bridgestone, puis Bridgestone
We
2.0,
have the
en
Bridgestone
posant justement très clairement dans
2.0
le
agenda,
débat
which is very
la
significant
question
in that
de
because that
la lutte
brings
contre la
our
pauvreté, des
attention
défis
to
des pays
fighting
intermédiaires, des pays en
poverty
développement comme des pays intermédiaires,
and the
et
challenges
celle de la
of
résilience climatique.
developing and
Mia.
intermediary countries and climate change. Mia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel.
Je voudrais commencer, pardon, je te coupe la parole.
sorry.
I just wanted
Have
to
to
start
interrupt
by conveying a message of solidarity to Barbados and all the colleagues of the region, because as you are here, and I want to thank you here for your leadership and your inspiration, your country was hurt by a big hurricane very early in the season. And please convey our regards, solidarity to your people, and we will be here for sure for whatever you need. But thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. And thank you for recognizing that the Eastern Caribbean, as we speak, is facing Tropical Storm Brett and its continued effects. And we appreciate the solidarity expressed by you and others here. I think we can claim movement. The issue will always be now, are we moving fast enough and with enough scope? The ambition has certainly increased in the last 2 days. And I think we've heard from the statements this morning from Secretary Yellen, from the Prime Minister of China, from yourself, from the President of Ghana, from Kristalina, that there is the political consensus that this issue is bigger than each and every one of us, and that we have to be able to work together to be able to make a difference. The multilateral development banks will have to change how they do business, and I think that is accepted. The last statement by Secretary Yellen that recognizes the possibility of working with the private sector and philanthropy to boost its capacity to meet the challenges of global public goods is really the issue. We've been talking about climate, but let us talk about the pandemic. The reality is that whether you take the numbers given by the pharmaceutical companies of at least 1 billion, there are 10 pathogens that we need to scale up work on to be ready for phase 2A in the event of a challenge so that we can move with speed. There are 5 pathogens that we need to deal with antimicrobial resistance. That is going to be the biggest problem that the world will face by 2050 in terms of killing people, and that will reverse a century of medical progress. What is needed is somewhere between 1 billion, if you listen to the pharmaceutical companies, and Ngozi, your commission, 10 billion. That is, if we take the higher number, the cost of 30 F-22s. That's what it is. And therefore, the choice for us to put that money aside is too simple for us not to do it. We all went through COVID, and we all saw how COVID decimated each and every one of us, carrying some countries back 2 to 3 decades. So I ask us to recognize that the moment has come for this to be the new decision point for what an international bank for reconstruction and development looks like in the third decade of the 21st century. It is not the fifth or sixth decade of the 20th century. Secondly, I want to thank us for being able to realize the promises that were made. And that's important in keeping trust. But I fear that if we don't go to Dubai with a record, we will lose the trust of the global population. Dr. Sultan spoke this morning. I think the time has come for us not to speak in silos anymore. And it therefore means bringing together, just as we've come together in Paris as global leaders with the international organizations, that we need now to sit down with the private sector leaders across oil and gas, across renewable energy, across finance, insurance, transport, if we are going to find a common problem, a common solution to our problem, unless there is a plan to go and live on Mars, we do not have a choice. And I hope that this convocation and conversation can take place within the next 4 to 8 weeks. We cannot go to the world's population again making promises and yet saying that this is the most urgent problem facing mankind. We have the capacity to act urgently when we need to. Well, we need to now. Rules are made by us. They're not made to break us. We are made to shape them. And if we can't shape the rules in this time as others shaped them before, then we will be the ones accountable for what potentially can be the worst reality of mankind. To believe that human species will exist forever and to believe that failed societies don't happen is to assume an arrogance that is not reflected in our history. And I trust, therefore, Emmanuel, that we will leave here with a greater commitment to ensure that that urgency takes place. I believe also that geopolitics and national politics cannot be allowed to stand in the way of this great crisis. If you cut each of one of us, we bleed. We have the same needs. And we therefore, as the Prime Minister of China just said, recognize that we have to find the common bounds and bridges where we can work together. This matter of the climate crisis is the panacea to be able to allow us to fight off the global politics and the domestic national politics. And I fear that if we don't act with alacrity, then we will see too many people losing their lives and livelihoods. So we leave Paris not with speeches simply, but with a commitment, as the president of Ghana said, to get down into the granular detail to make sure that that which we agree here can be executed. I'm satisfied that the start is correct with respect to the mobilization of the 200 billion, but we know deep down that's not going to be enough. And hence, the parallel discussions for the reform of governance must take place. The last point that I want to make is this. Difficult discussions require courage. And the most difficult discussion that we face is how do we shape a world in the image of the countries of today. Regrettably, it means that each of us must give up some space if we are to shape that new world. And because we don't want to give up space, we now are forced to, because of the outside and existential challenges. That is actually the way of life. Life presents us with the things that we least want to do when we least have the capacity to do it. But if we don't summon the courage to rise to the occasion, then we will pay the ultimate price. We have never had the appropriate discussions for the dismantling of an imperial order. And whether it is in the United Nations system or whether it is in the multilateral development banks, regrettably, we continue to see first-class and second-class citizens. Bob Marley had a song called War. We would do well to go back and read the lyrics of it, and not just to read them, but to walk the walk and to talk the talk. I want to thank each and every one of us who has come here, because above all else, I sense a genuineness in the hearts of people here, because I think deep down, we all realize this is our moment with destiny. Thank you.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you very much. Je vais peut-être maintenant donner la parole au président Zedi, qui est pas simplement président des Comores, mais aussi celui de l'Union africaine. Il est bien familier des enjeux d'insularité qui ont été évoqués à l'instant par la Première ministre Niamotlé, mais aussi ceux de la grande pauvreté, pour nous dire comment il voit justement la redéfinition de cet agenda à la fois pauvreté et climat pour le continent africain.
Merci, mon cher frère, de donner la parole.
Dear brother, for giving me the floor.
Encore une fois,
once again,
on dit chez nous, trop de viande ne gâte pas la sauce.
We say too much meat to spoil the sauce, but thank you for your warm hospitality. Thank you for your hospitality and the pleasant setting you have provided us for our work and our discussions. So very sincerely, I thank you, President. So much has been said, and I've been highly appreciative of people's contributions and their optimism, all our optimisms in terms of achieving our goals. As you said just now, I very much hope that we will be able to make the decisions that are needed, the G20 or G7 or wherever, because we're all in the same world and we have to understand what is happening. And there are so many things going on, but we have to manage them together. Thank you once again. As you said, President of the African Union, and as such, I would ask all of you for the next G20 summit in New Delhi, accepts African Union as a full member. Thank you very much. And I would ask my brother Lula perhaps to be our advocate and make our case for us. So, Chairman, Mr. President, we have understood what has been said. There is a lot of hope, of course, as you've said. So we need hope, but we also need to be cautious about everything that's said. We have to make sure that we give ourselves necessary resources to achieve these goals. And there's good news there, because there are other countries or in Africa or elsewhere have been quoted as being able to contribute. So I think this proves that we're all going to move in this journey together. So as you know, we all went through COVID together and we learned a lot from this. It taught us that we're together in this. We can't close our eyes when our friends, neighbors, or enemies have a problem, because security affects all of us. Climate security, when the climate goes wrong and breaks down, it affects all of us, and we know what the consequences of this is, why we must follow this closely. And even if in your countries you're better off, you have to realize that it's important to help others to get better off. That'll reassure us all. So whether we're talking about Europe or Africa, we need to address all the issues together. We have many fronts open, but we have to mobilize on all of them. As the President said, we can't close our eyes on any problems. This is why, President, even if there is war in Ukraine and there are problems in Africa, the solutions will be found together, being fully aware that if we take all the necessary measures, we will achieve our goals. Much has been said here, but I think there is a lesson we need to take away, which is security, and that means young people. You know the problems we have in Africa with high percentages of young people, but they're going to be the drivers of development. If we don't take care of them, that will turn against us, so that will hold us back from our goals. We know about immigration. It affects all of us. We know what the root causes of that. It's because there are no opportunities for the young people, because and that is the result of what we're saying here. So if we manage to tackle that problem, I think that will be something will deliver tangible results. So if we're talking about young people and training, it's the private sector entrepreneurship that needs to intervene to help people take care of themselves. And that's what we need to do. If we teach young people to take care of themselves, I think that will be more security for everybody, for those who are able to work and those who are no longer able to work. So in conclusion, I will turn to the bankers. Thank you for what you're doing, but most of the time, when you go to a banker, you have a certain number of things to do, because you're always asked to be flexible. We have to be very careful, as we said. In any case, thank you very much for your hospitality. Thank you, all of you, for your participation, your input. We from Africa are part of this. We are going to play our role. We want to have our voice heard. The Africa Free Trade Area is something that we're asking your support for. You've committed to this, and I hope that will happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President Assoumani. Well, thank you very much for telling us more about the African continent. Now I'd like to turn to President Sisi, who is organizing the energy transition in his country and in partnership with the European continent. So which are the necessary conditions for successful impact, and how you see we can articulate fighting against poverty in a country which has 105 million inhabitants, and increasing and rapidly increasing demography, and which is conducting this energy transition? In name of God, I would like to thank you, Mr. President Macron. First of all, allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to express my sincerest thanks to President Macron for organizing this conference. I would also like to thank the President for his friendship, for his unflinching support to Egypt. This comes as no surprise to us, since France has always been alongside Egypt, and we would like to thank you, President, and thank France first. So my speech will be slightly different from that of others, and I hope you will forgive me for expressing myself in a different way. I took part in the climate summit in 2015 in Paris, and at the time, and I apologize once again if I speak very openly to you I have no intention of pointing my finger at anybody in particular. I'm just saying that in 2015, there was a driving force here in Paris in the framework of the climate summit. And at the time, we had allocated $100 billion, and those funds were allocated by developed countries, and they were allocated as a contribution from those countries to climate action in developing countries, and this on an annual basis. Now, this was very good news. But I'm wondering today whether we lived up to our commitments. of providing 100,000 billion on an annual basis since 2015. So I'm turning to you, decision makers here in the room. You all know that there's a great difference between drafting a beautiful plan and implementing it. So very often when we move on to the implementation stage, we see that the results are not necessarily in line with what we had imagined. For 2 years, I took part in several conferences and summits, and all of this I did with all of my African colleagues. We went to Yemen, to China, to India. We also went to Russia, to the UK, etc., to India. We went all over to attend conferences and to be the apostles of this cooperation with the African continent, and namely with the industrial countries moving ahead pretty fast. Our colleagues, my African brothers, and our counterparts in the different countries which welcomed us, discussed matters at length. There was a clear will to do good, and everybody was prepared to cooperate. But I'm speaking today not on behalf of the African continent, but as a representative of a country taking part in this big conference. So I would like to say the following. There are two parts. One part that involves more advanced countries, rich countries, but there's also the other side of the same coin, i.e. the part that involves developing countries. We as well have a role to play. I mean, in all effectiveness, we have ideas that we can provide, and I would like to insist on this point. During COP27, we had drafted a new platform. Set it up. Germany, the US, and Denmark accepted to fund $10 million. This would allow us to cover 42% of our energy mix. So we have set up a partnership with developing countries and advanced countries, but this doesn't prevent us from coming up with good ideas to find a solution to our problems. So I'm just telling you what we did so far. One of President Schulz's advisors also worked with us on a project of having an electric train. This was part of the Sustainable Development Project and in the framework of Actions for the Climate. So this was part of finding new means of transportation that are either less polluting or non-polluting. So we discussed guarantees to be given to creditors, and the fact that Germany would take these risks on board. Germany accepted, and that was made possible because of this contribution given to us by Germany. We were able to set up the project. So this is a dynamic project that needs to keep going, and that we all need to take part in. Developed countries keep trying to advance and hope for a better development. So I'm asking myself the question, is the challenge we're facing clear to all of us? We've seen when the world realizes that we had a challenge in common, i.e. the COVID pandemic, that we mobilized ourselves all together, and we saw how the measures implemented were effective to fight the pandemic. So when the danger is well defined and the challenge is spelled out, this allows us to advance more effectively. Let me give you the example, our example in Egypt. I'll be very brief. Generally speaking, we hear many promises, and leaders in our developing countries are used to promising a better world and whenever there are upcoming elections. But I did the exact contrary. I promised my people to work day in, day out, and to keep on working, and I will only be happy when we will have inaugurated a project, when we will have implemented it. Allow me to conclude, Mr. President, by saying the following now. Leadership is all about responsibility. So we have advanced countries, rich countries, in terms of resources and technologies, and these countries need to live up to their responsibility towards the poorer countries. So we're talking about an ethics-based responsibility and even a political responsibility. So as for the topic we're discussing today, at the time we had talked about 100 billion in contributions. That was in 2015. So I turned to the President of the European Union and I made the following offer. We have a suggestion to set up a fundamental infrastructure on the African continent, and the improvement of this infrastructure will be key to our success. So I had said that there would be, for example, an amount allocated out of those 100 billion, a given amount allocated to the African continent. So I said, no matter what the amount is, but we want not it to be in terms of donations. These funds need to be allocated in other ways as well. And this amount needs to be allocated to projects. So I invited German companies, for example, to come and take stock of the situation themselves and to see in what kind of projects these amounts, the earmarked amounts, so we're going to be allocated in infrastructure projects, for example, no matter what the amount would be. So French companies need to see as well where the money was going to go, what it would be invested in, and this goes for any other countries, China and any other advanced countries. So believe me, we often mention human rights, and I fully agree on how important they are. But what I want to say is that for the last 10 years, we've seen clandestine migration from Africa towards Europe. 1,700 people die every year in this clandestine migration movement. Women, children, they were forced to migrate because there was no hope for a better life in Africa for them. So if this carries on, they will carry on trying to migrate towards Europe. In Egypt, we have 9 million people we welcome every year into our country. And I would like to thank you because France has always provided an important contribution to all of these important topics. So I thank you once again, and I apologize if I was too frank in my speech. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. This is very consistent with the agenda followed by Chancellor Scholz with a compact in Africa. And now give the floor to Olaf Scholz and thank him for being here and attending this conference.
Thank you. I think it's a very important meeting we have here and had yesterday. A lot of questions have been discussed, many proposals have been made, and they are all about the relevant question how we can fight poverty and give chances for development, and how we can fight climate change. And we learned together and agreed, I think this was said by many, that this is not an alternative. It must be our aim to make it happen that we meet both challenges. As there are a lot of meetings where a lot of speeches are held, I think it is also important that we always walk as we talk. This is what you said, and I do agree very much. So it is always important that especially the more economically stable and successful countries do their contributions and that they stick to the things they say all the time. The first question, I think, is that we are sticking to our words, speaking about development aid and climate financing. There are a lot of aims that have been agreed on in meetings in the past following the Paris Agreement, and I think there will be more to come in the next years. But it is important that we do something, that this really works. And so just speaking about Germany, we will stick to what we do, being front runners in development aid financing and being front runners in finding international climate financing. And I ask all to participate in this because it is about walking as you talk. The second is that we have to do ourselves what we ask others to do. So if we understand it is a necessary aim that we fight climate change, and in the case of Germany, we say that we will be ready with a CO2 neutral industrial country in 2045. This means a lot because being strongly industrialized, it's not just about housing or some forms of mobility or the electric grid, it's about industry. And that's a big, big change from today. And this is what we do. And we are now having a lot of aims. And one of them is in 2030, we will have 80% of our electricity production coming from renewables. This is just one aspect of all the things that have to be changed. But it is also a very good message to the rest, because if we do so, we are using and developing technologies that could be used cheaply in many other places. It is not in the end that sticking to using fossil resources is cheaper if we are successful with our technological advantages we are working for. And that is feasible now. It is not a question of the future, something to be done later. It can be done now. And so also in this case, we have to walk as we talk, speaking about these questions at conferences like this. There is a debate about the international financial architecture. And my view is that really we have to do something to work on the questions of reforms of the World Bank and the multilateral development banks. And there is this evolution roadmap where Germany worked very much with many partners for the World Bank and for the multilateral development banks. And I appreciate very much that so many are supporting this activity, including the new president. And I think this is very important because we need a change to have more money that could be used with just changing the way how these banks are managed and the framework for their activities. And if we do this very fast, this will have a very concrete outcome for many people. And I'm very happy that this is now going forward and is supported by so many. Secondly, I think we have to fight against the problems of nature crisis coming especially from climate change, but not only. And if you are not a very rich country, it is much more difficult to face these crises if they are happening to you all at once. And because of this, I think it is necessary that we work together. And the global shield that has now been agreed should come into practice, and that we form something that gives countries that are in that desperate situation gets the necessary support, because otherwise they will not able to work on this question. Working for against climate change is also something where we have to discuss with our businesses and our industries at home. And when we do so, they always ask us that we should give them security that when they follow the path, this is not a risk for them in competition with other countries. And yes, this is true. But what to do. It is about tariffs? I doubt. I think we have to understand that we need something extra. And that is the idea behind the International Climate Club, which has been founded and which is working now with so many countries from the global south and more to come, because it's the idea to cooperate when we have the same ambitions, though we are following different paths to get there. And doing this, I think, is a very important aspect for world economy to be safe when this big change all over the world is taking place. I think also it is important that we understand that it is not just about development aid and international climate financing, which is necessary, and I said it must be huge and we must stick to the things we say. It's also important that we make it that businesses are investing in the countries of Asia, of Africa, and South America. If they don't do so, we will not have enough means just with public subsidies to get where we want to go. And creating an atmosphere where this works, I think, is very important. And especially looking to Africa, I think the compact with Africa is the idea that is working into this direction. And I'm very happy to see many of you in this meeting we will have in Berlin with the compact in Africa, which is important. I would like to repeat what I had the chance to say yesterday. I think we also have to understand that there is a need for change in trade policies and the way how we act. And one of the aspects is about exploration, excavation. There are a lot of resources spread all over the world. But the way the global economy is dealing with them is that we take them from the ground and then bring them to countries and work there. Yes, a lot of things will be done in countries where there is a lot of industry to work with, but I think the first refinement should be done in the countries where the resources are. This would create jobs and growth and gives the chance that we also invest in the environment over there, and for also especially looking at indigenous people and others, because otherwise it is just a story of some people becoming rich using the resources. It should be something that is happening at the places where the resources are. And let me continue with what the next question, which bothers me a lot, especially looking at the consequences of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We learn from this war, not just about the dangers to our peace, security arrangements, but also that there is just a very few countries producing fertilizers that are so important for the world. And though the natural resources and the economic abilities are there in Africa, for instance, or the South of America, or in many Asian countries to produce fertilizers, it's still monopolized by a very small number of countries. And I think discussing about fair development should include the idea of creating factories for fertilizers all over the globe so that we have a more resilient structure and that we can help many people to get there. So my view is we have to take our responsibility for the globe. We have to stick to our words. We have to walk as we talk. But if we do so, I think there's a good chance that we make our place a better world. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Olaf.
Well, thank you very much, Olaf.
Je vais demander au président Hichilema peut-être de revenir sur
Hichilema to come back and talk about these topics and our debt issues. And I would like to congratulate him on the agreement that was passed to renegotiate Zambia's debt. Mr. President, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President Macron, and for hosting us and for everything else that my colleagues have already mentioned. So thank you. I also want to thank all of us, heads of state and government that are present here, and our partners, our own institutions, multilateral institutions, and obviously I do appreciate that we have other stakeholders that are here, so thank you very much. Let me be abusive a little bit, President Macron, and start by doing what is necessary on behalf of our people of Zambia, to thank greatly the achievement that was scored yesterday. One of the deliverables for this summit, and President Macron is aware, I came down here and requested that obviously also the President of China, that we should ensure that by the time this summit takes place, we'll have delivered the Zambia debt restructuring project. And as at yesterday, this is one of the deliverables at this summit. Thank you to China. Thank you to France for chairing the G20 framework. Thank you to South Africa for being the deputy chair for this process, and also to all of the countries that in one way or another supported this process to reach the conclusion it did yesterday, and the benefit it would deliver to other debtor countries, because Zambia was more or less used like a guinea pig. And we are now in this situation, and we hope that the lessons of that process can be learned and learned correctly and be applied to the other processes that will commence starting, I believe, following this summit. I must give special thank you to the US government for their support, European Union for their support. Indeed, most of us as debtor countries also were speaking to each other, learning from each other. Thank you very much. Let me move quickly to the issue of, I can't forget creditors. Creditors. Thank you so much to the creditors, all of you, diversified as you are. Obviously, some are large, some are smaller, but without your cooperation, this was not going to be possible. But I must also say thank you to the people of Zambia for their patience. We took this project as one of our responsibilities before we formed government as an opposition party, that debt restructuring was a critical deliverable for us. And the people of Zambia were very patient, extremely patient, pain on the other side because of the structural adjustment, the structural processes. And if there's one lesson that I want to share with other countries, that leadership is crucial at the country level, to be clear of what you want and say so to your people. The people may not support everything that's necessary. Institutional reform, consumption expenditure controls, I dare say, habits of corruption are enjoyed by many in our countries. And when you put reforms, you confront them as well. But it's important to be intentional as leaders and then deliver that to our communities. They will go through the pain, but they will support you, as Zambians have done that. Thank you very much to the people of Zambia. Let me put context to this. Poverty, climate change. We have already argued that these are intertwined. There's no question about it. Let me draw the first aspect of the connection. Even before we talk about financing, new financing, more financing, when countries are not growing economically, you cannot expect a poor person to carry an additional burden. That is necessary to drive growth, to drive development. So poverty actually exacerbates the climate change mitigation measures, I argue. And it's very clear. If you are asking your poor people to switch energy sources, can they afford from charcoal to cleaner energy? They're already stressed. So we need to find mechanisms to support the poor in our countries, less privileged. I heard this word called poverty, the poor, but the less privileged, to be able to come through to support the changes that are required to mitigate climate change negative effects. I think that's very, very important. It's also true to say climate change, on the flip side, has imposed new obligations on the less privileged. For example, a farmer you saw, a farmer you went to visit, Secretary Yellen, Treasury Secretary Yellen, before they could, on 1 hectare, produce 2 hectares, produce enough for themselves and an excess for sale. But climate change measures have made it one season, the same rain season, one part of it is a drought. When the rain comes, it's a flood, one season. What chance does that farmer have? They absolutely don't have. So as we talk about climate change mitigations, financing, support, technology, farming methods, issues of genetics in agriculture, early maturing varieties, I'm just giving an example. Context are important to consider. So it's not just laying the resource envelope on the table. It is digging inside that envelope. How do we apply that envelope in order to take care of the challenges that have arisen from climate change? And therefore the investments being directed in those specific areas that will produce results that will assist the less privileged to first produce food for themselves, to also produce excess for revenue to look after their households. But also it's important to look at water harvesting as an area of investment, to look at irrigation. Chairman Chancellor, the technology comes in and it's all there, it's available around the world. It's a question of pulling it together and targeting it. Let me also indicate here one of the lessons of our debt restructuring that is applicable to poverty reduction, to climate change, is the issue around speed at which we do things. G20 framework, when we took office 21 months ago, this discussion was already in train. Now we've been in office 21 months. Yes, we're very pleased that it happened yesterday. But for the countries that are coming after us, there's need to expedite the processes. Just that, whether it's, if you like, energy transition, as Senegal was involved, is involved in that, we must just be conscious of time. Every day we don't deliver these things that are within our control, we are basically increasing the cost and the damage gets compounded. I think it's very important. The next lesson I want to suggest here, relevant to the subject on the table, is that Chairman Chancellor's point yesterday at dinner, repeated today, is so important for us as a global community to mobilize resources, yes, but these resources must be invested to help grow the economies of the less developed countries. Very important, because by doing that, we are creating capacity in those economies to mitigate against climate change and obviously poverty reduction. So value addition, not just with the electric vehicle industry that is coming through, huge industry. It is important, President Macron, that we look at deliberately investing in extraction, critical minerals, for example, in value adding these minerals in country. Obviously that will help the growth side of the GDP, create jobs, business opportunities for the transactional chain in there, if I may call it that. So I think this must be deliberate as well. Rather than generic discussions, we must dive deep into the envelope and begin to say, these are requirements, these are needs, these are minimums. And it will mutually benefit, as somebody said yesterday, not to polarize the conversation, the North and the South. It will definitely, if it's structured properly, benefit the North, the South. And that's not the debate we must be engaging in, but mutuality for greater good, for a safe world, for a world that we can pass on to the next generation in a responsible manner. Lastly, I simply want to indicate that I like the spirit of partnership that I hear. I like what I hear from leaders, all of you who have spoken. I think that's the way it should be. But the thing is now to pull all this in one basket, draw an action plan, which is time-bound, and we get a job done. If the political leadership is there, business leadership is there, decisions are clear, we now need to get our technical people not to sit on the work that needs to be done. So supervision, monitoring is important. Lastly, and this is the last one really, I want to thank what I hear from the Chinese Premier, what I hear from Secretary Yellen, and indeed all the leaders that have spoken on the issue of conflict. We cannot achieve what we want to achieve if we allow our global community to focus time, resources, everything, technology, on conflict. I think there's a duty for us all to keep our individual countries peaceful, out of conflict, and not export instability to other countries, neighboring or far away. As we now know, instability anywhere is instability everywhere. I think it's very important that we work on that issue and focus the resources, focus the time, and all the other capital provisions on the development agenda to mitigate climate change, to reduce poverty. And I must also indicate here, the cost of capital must sit in this basket, that it must be lowered. The inequity around the cost of capital, Africa, for example, pays the highest cost of capital, is not correct. It doesn't help anybody at all. It just worsens the situation. We must address this situation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President. Je vais maintenant donner la parole au président du Brésil, Lula, demande de Cyril Ramaphosa pour Afrique du Sud. Président, sur votre vision justement de cette transformation de l'architecture et du système financier international pour traiter à la fois la question de la pauvreté et du climat. La parole est à toi.
Primeiro, eu queria cumprimentar o presidente Emmanuel Macron,
Let me
presidente da República Francesa,
salute the President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, on whose behalf I also greet all of the heads of state and government participating at this high-level meeting. I should also like to greet the ex-president of Brazil and now the president of the BRICS Bank, with whom I also salute all of the representatives of development banks and other banks present here. I am speaking, of course, of Ms. Dilma Rousseff. I should like to say to you, Mr. Macron, that since yesterday evening, I have changed my speech. I went to Italy. I prepared a speech and I've changed it 10 times and I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to read it out. I would like, however, to sound the alarm on something very important. In 2025, we'll be holding COP30 in a country of the Amazon basin. And I hope that everyone who loves Amazonia, who greatly admires Amazonia, who says that it's the lungs of the world, I hope that those same people will participate in COP30 in Paraná State so they can have an idea of what Amazonia is. Because many people talk about Amazonia, but few people have actually been there. It's important to know what Amazonia is. In Brazil, Amazonia represents 5 million square kilometers. And beyond that vast surface area, we also have Amazonia in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Peru, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and also in Guyana, and Suriname. And of course, French Guiana. So we will, on August 14th, organize a great meeting in Para State with all of the presidents of the Latin American region making up the Amazonian basin so that we can set forth a proposal for COP28 in the United Arab Emirates. We'll be having discussions with Congo and Indonesia, because what we would like would be to share and have a single proposal from countries that have great forest areas. And we want to make this heritage not simply in environmental terms, but also economically speaking, to help people who live in forests. In the Brazilian forest, we have 400 indigenous peoples, and of these, or rather, these speak 300 different languages. In the same region, there are many problems and difficulties, especially organized crime. There's often people who act in very bad faith and act in such a way that the forest is cut down and planted with soybeans or corn, or that cattle is raised there, whereas it's not necessary to do any of that. The business leaders responsible for this know that this is happening. They know they're doing bad things. They know that this will create serious problems, even with products that are meant to sell to other countries. That's the first thing I wanted to say to you. Brazil is a country which has an energy mix which is the cleanest in the world. In terms of electricity, 87% of our energy is renewable, whereas in the rest of the world, the figure is more like 27%. For energy as a whole, 50% of Brazilian renewable energy is renewable, whereas in the rest of the world, we see more like 15%. And that means that we are on the right path. We're going to meet our campaign pledge of zero deforestation by 2030. We're not only talking about Amazonia, but also about other biomes, the Pantanal, Caatinga, the Cerrado, the Atlantic forest. There are 5 major biomes that we must look after, all of which are being attacked year in, year out. There are fires. Sometimes there's excessive rainfall. There are also human predators who plant things that are not meant to be planted in these regions. Over and above Amazonia, I should also like to talk, and over above climate issues, we need to talk about inequality in the world. It's not possible in a meeting bringing together heads of state and government that we not talk about inequalities of wages, of race, of sex and gender, of education and health. We have a world which is becoming increasingly unequal, and more we see wealth being concentrated in the hands of those who are already the richest, and that poverty is also becoming ever greater. So these inequalities need to be talked about. They should be as great a priority as climate issues. We can talk about, or we can't talk about climate problems as long as problems of inequality have not been dealt with. When I was president of my country from 2003 to 2010, and then President Dilma from 2010 to 2016, the United Nations recognized that Brazil had come out of hunger, and at that time we acted in such a way that 36 million people left absolute poverty and 40 million people enter the middle class. 13 years later, I am president again, and there are 33 million people who are going hungry. When I left the presidency, Brazil was the 6th largest economy in the world, and today it is the 12th largest. All of this is to say that we have fallen back in the same way as many other countries have. That depends obviously on the government which is elected and the social priorities of such governments. We do have to say very clearly of what has been created after the Second World War. The Bretton Woods institutions are no longer functioning and no longer correspond to the aspirations nor the interests of our societies. And we need to say that very clearly. The World Bank is not meeting the world's expectations. And we need to say this very clearly. The IMF as well is not meeting the world's expectations. And very often banks lend money because governments are failing. This is what we're seeing in Argentina presently. Argentina very irresponsibly, or IMF very irresponsibly made Argentina a huge loan. And we don't know what the Argentine president did with that money. And today, Argentina is in a very difficult economic situation because it doesn't have enough dollars to pay the IMF back. It's very important for us to realize that we cannot go on working with the same institutions working in this incorrect way. And the same thing goes for the United Nations Security Council. We can't simply reproduce policies of a past time. The representatives of 1945 are not the same ones we need today. The United Nations needs to change. It needs to become more representative. The United Nations was able to create the State of Israel in 1948, but it is not able to solve the problem of the occupation of the State of Palestine. We need to say that. So if we do not change these institutions, climate issues will just be a joke, really. Why do I say this? Because who is going to respect the decisions made by the fora that we organize? We need to be clear. Who is going to make commitments to or apply the Kyoto Protocol? Who is going to respect the decisions of COP10 in Copenhagen, the Paris Agreement? This is to say that we cannot respect those commitments because there is no strong world governance. If each and every one of us leaves these meetings or agreements and go back to our own countries, they won't be approved. So we need to say very clearly that if we don't change our institutions, the world will remain the same. And the rich will go on being rich and the poor will go on being poor. That's what happens. And I'm saying this with great sorrow because I have considerable experience of governance for the poor. And I always say the problem isn't the poor. The poor are always the solution when you put them into a country's budget. But if you act as if they're not there, if you put everything else in the budget, you will never have money to deal with people who are living in great poverty because they have no unions, they don't demonstrate, they don't have movements, they live far from centers of government, and they'll always be left to their own devices because inequality is growing. I've been hearing for almost 20 years about 900 million people in the world who will go to bed hungry. And the situation does not change. How can we fix this if we don't even put the situation on our agenda? How can we repair inequalities if they're not on the agendas of our meetings? I would say, Mr. Macron, that the world political class only gives value to poor people at election time, because poor people are a country's most important heritage, but after elections, they're forgotten, left to fend for themselves. So I congratulate you for this meeting. I was made familiar with an African Union project which was talking about an investment of $360 million investment in infrastructure on the whole African continent. If the developed world finances companies to build infrastructure according to this plan, Africa will reach a new level in terms of infrastructure. We heard from the president of Congo about the Congo River. And this river could host 3 Brazilian power plants, but he can't do this because he hasn't got the money. And we don't want to be preaching about how funds are to be used. People say, I want to help people do this and that, but in fact, what we need to do is have a qualitative leap. We need to invest in infrastructure and things which really change people's lives. The creation of BRICS, of other banks, of trading currencies, the WTO. I ask myself why we've given up on this. There were elections in the United States in 2009. President Bush have left these banks at that time. And I thought that Obama was going to recreate these institutions, but the WTO isn't doing a lot today. And that's why we have the problems that we have. You remember the London G20. So as to avoid rich countries making investments in poor countries. What happened? And it was the return of protectionism. And what do we see today? What we see is a return of poverty on all continents. Let's take the case of Brazil. I was very proud no longer to be on the map of hunger when President Dilma took over. And now I've come back to being president, and I see very sadly that in a democratic level, we're in a much worse situation because of the fascists who governed us before. And in education as well, we're much worse off because we're no longer investing in universities. And on social level, it's much worse because there was no longer any social policy. On the economic level, it's worse as well. And today, we need to get back to work. Redo everything we did. Everything we accomplished in 2000 and 2016 will have to start over again so the country gets back on the path to growth. And the only thing I wanted to say to you in the course of this meeting is that the climate issue is not a secondary one. And Brazil will effectively get a handle on deforestation. It is a matter of honor for us to say that by 2030 there will no longer be any deforestation in Amazonia. We have 30 million hectares of land that has been degraded. You don't need to cut down a tree, to plant corn or soybeans, or to raise cattle. Damaged lands must be restored, and we also have to think about our international agreements for trade, for the environment. We have to be working with just instruments. All I dream of is having an agreement with the European Union. But this won't be possible as long as we have this additional burden that the European Union is demanding. We're not going to be able to sign an agreement in these conditions. I've asked for an answer, and I'm waiting for this answer. How can we have a strategic partnership with threats being made against a strategic partner? How do you expect us to sign an agreement in these circumstances? If I could, I would take Chancellor Scholz and I would make a Minister of Mines and Industry in my country so that we could transform our situation, so that all of the ore in our country could be processed in my country. That was the best thing we heard yesterday at dinner and this morning, because it's true, after all, that we are exporters of raw materials, and we don't hold on to any of the things we produce. In many places in the world, firms that mine ore do not have reforestation. They just dig holes and then off they go somewhere else. So I will say to you, I've come back to being president of my country after so many years, and you know that I'm 77 years old. I'm 77, but my will is to do things and to abandon someone who has 30 years of existence here. I will tell you that I will invite you, Olaf Scholz, to Amazonia so that you can see that deforestation has been reduced to zero. And once again, we will suppress hunger. Dilma knows perfectly well what we did to eliminate hunger. And she is now president of the BRICS Bank. She can prepare all the necessary papers to be signed to give loans to Brazil and many other countries, because we really changed things. Some people are afraid, I think, when they hear me say that we need to create a new currency for trading. I don't know why Brazil and Argentina need to trade in dollars. Why shouldn't we do this in our own currencies? Why should Brazil and China not be able to trade using their own currencies? Why do I need to buy dollars? That is a subject that is on my agenda. And if it was up to me and me alone, we would discuss this at the next BRICS meeting, which will happen in September. And at the G20 meeting as well, because there we're going to need to have more African colleagues participating in the G20, just as you're having it happen at the G7 meetings. These fora cannot be a club for the happy few, for the political elite. We need to bring different people, people suffering from inequality, because we need to realize that these problems are everyone's problems. We're all following a parameter, an example. Look at what happened in the European Union, President Macron. You know this. I think that the construction of the European Union is democratic heritage. After 2 world wars, you managed to construct, to build this European Union, a parliament, and to go on living with your own divergences, having democratic discussions. And that's what I want for South America. We need this. The African Union is much better organized than we are in Latin America. And we can organize ourselves. And we can create new trade blocs to negotiate with the European Union. But excuse me here, the World Bank, the IMF, but I think you really have to have a good look at the way you work. You need more money. You need to have new orientations, more participants in your management. You shouldn't always have the same little closed club from 1945, 46, 47, 48. Dear Emmanuel Macron, thank you for this meeting, and please be prepared because I am back and with a will to fight even harder than I did 13 years ago. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Président.
Thank you so much, President.
Rendez-vous est pris pour l'Amazonie.
See you in Amazonia then.
J'ai peut-être donné la parole à Cyril
Maybe I'll
Ramaphosa
give
avant de
the
conclure.
floor to Cyril Ramaphosa before we wind up.
Thank you very much, President Macron. Let me start off by saying, President Lula, don't worry, when we have the BRICS meeting, the issue of currency is top on the agenda. So we are going to discuss it. President Macron, I just want to start off on a very positive note in terms of what I think is evolving here. I think there is consensus that is clearly embraced by everyone that we need to address climate and poverty because they go together. There's a nexus. And as it were, we need to burn the candle on both sides. So that's important. So that's agreed. And we all recognize and accept that we need capital at scale to address the key challenges that many countries in the world face, particularly the developing economy countries. And we also would be agreed that there needs to be more cooperation and coordination between your development banks, multilateral development banks, and the private sector. There needs to be coordination so that there is no fragmentation, which you kept talking about. But I think what is important to many of us is that there should be solid consensus on the reform of the financial architecture of the world. Because without that reform, the dreams and the objectives that we have to address our challenges will not be realized. And those reforms need to touch on a whole range of issues. Mr. Mo Ibrahim yesterday even spoke about something that we may think is insignificant, that the boards of directors of your multilateral institutions are not made up of independent directors. They are largely internal people or shareholders. So that in itself, for us, it's an important reform. We also need to look at the distribution of the special drawing rights. I find it a bit difficult to be told that this is set in the rules and it will forever be like that, and that it's either you get 0 or you get 34 billion. In our view, this is not a zero-sum game. It's a game where we all need to be dealt with equity in an equitable manner. And there is a need for reform in that regard as well. And the other important thing for this to happen, it will help us not to participate as unequal cousins in these institutions. It will help us to participate fully, and so that we don't have a sense that we are beggars, that we are being dealt with out of generosity. I think it's important in the new era that the world is in now that there should be a good measure of equality among sovereign nations. You know, recently, 7 African countries decided to go and put a call for peace to Ukraine and to Russia. And we raised a number of issues. Zambia was represented, Comoros was represented, Republic of Congo was represented, Senegal was represented, Uganda, as well as South Africa. So we were all represented, and Egypt as well. So we were all at one. that even as we were going to address an issue of the war which has had a negative impact on the African continent, which is the rise in prices for food, rise in prices for fertilizers, we were clear that we are not going there as beggars. We're not going to ask for a favor to both Ukraine and Russia. We were going there to say, open up the Black Sea Channel so that the grains and the fertilizers should go into the world market. So we were not on a begging mission, even as we are in great need as a continent and all that. That should go to demonstrate that Africa should never be seen as a continent that needs generosity. We want to be treated as equals. Even in the multilateral institutions, we want to be treated as equals. And if our equity is at a low ebb, there must be ways in which that can be addressed. To us, this is very important. Our sovereignty is one of the things that we hold on dearly to. And we demonstrated that very clearly to both President Zelensky and to President Putin when it came to this issue. Even as there were suggestions that, yes, we can donate this, we can donate that, we said, we want you to release these grains and fertilizers to the world market so that the world can trade in these commodities and other issues we can handle in a different way. I wanted to make that point so that it should be understood where Africa has evolved up to. We want to be key players on the world stage, want to be key players even in the financial markets and in the MDBs. Now, these are the positive things. I do, Mr. President Macron, want us to address another issue, which to us is a bit of a negative. You will have heard President Sisi talking about the 100 billion that was promised in Paris. President Sassou Nguesso yesterday as well also spoke about it at the dinner. Now, there is that issue that a number of the commitments that have been made have not really been fully lived up to. But before I get into details, let me immediately say that we recognize the many initiatives that have been put on the table, and a number of countries here have done so. Germany has gone out of the way to put a number of initiatives, and the US has also done a number of things. But there have been times when we felt like we were beggars. I played a key role as chair of the African Union during the COVID period. We felt like we were beggars when it came to vaccine availability, when we felt we needed access to vaccines, and the Northern Hemisphere countries had bought all the vaccines in the world, and they were hogging them. And they didn't want to release them at the time when we needed them most. And we felt like we were begging. And at times it felt like they would just be droppings from the table, that yes, we will give you that and that. And let me tell you something that generated a lot of resentment. We resented that, and it got worse when we said we want to manufacture our own vaccines. And when we went to the WTO, there was a lot of resistance, enormous resistance. And we kept saying, what is more important, life or profits by your big pharmaceutical companies? And that too, I must tell you now, generated and deepened that disappointment and resentment on our part, because we felt like life in the Northern Hemisphere is much more important than life in the global South. And these are issues that need to be addressed. And I'm glad that we are all seated here like this, because we've got to get to the heart of these matters and address them. Now, I come to promises that have been made. And Chancellor Scholz was saying, we've got to walk the talk. Yes, we want to see the talk being walked. President Sassou Nguesso yesterday said at the dinner, $100 billion was promised per year. And he was saying, I've never seen that. And many of us will testify that that $100 billion has never really been made available. And this should stand out as something that needs to be addressed. Because sometimes we sit at conferences like this and say, yes, we'll make this available, and we believe you. We believe you, but now the tire must hit the tar. We must now see action flowing from that. Now, I want to then talk about something very practical. President Sassou Nguesso raised it yesterday. He said he would be happy if flowing from this summit, we do something very practical on the infrastructure side. Having said that 600 million people in Africa do not have electricity, and yet we've got all the resources to generate electricity, particularly the mighty Congo River, and that there have been plans to build a number of power stations that will generate, in my calculation, up to 70,000 megawatts. And he said, and I want to speak in support of this proposal, that to prove that these summits are not summits where we just talk, flowing from the Paris COP as well as others, let us now put money on the table and collectively say we are going to address this mega project. A mega project which will in the end generate electricity for up to 12, 15 African countries all at one go. And this is a project that I think the multilateral development banks here working together, the call that you've made, President Macron, can actually fund. And where, as we rise from this, we should be able to say the Inga Dam is now going to be developed into the Inga Power Station, the one that President Sassou Nguesso mentioned, and the next one as well. If we can do that, then we as Africans will now be convinced that these summits are really meaningful. We will now go home and say, you know what, it's worthwhile going to these summits, coming to Europe, and to listen to all the promises because they are willing to act on the promises. This is what President Macron, I believe, will be one of the most important outcomes. The reform of the financial architecture, as well as a practical project, infrastructure project that is going to add a lot of value. President Sisi and I have been talking about a railway from Cape Town to Cairo for years. We will leave that for the next summit, but the one on generating electricity and building power stations on the Inga Dam is the most important, that is immediate, that I believe needs to be addressed now. Let's get that done, and then we will be convinced that you are serious with the promises that you make. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyril. Thank you, everybody. Mesdames et messieurs les chefs
Ladies and
d'État et de
gentlemen,
gouvernement, mesdames
heads
et
of
messieurs,
state and of
en vos
government,
grades et
ladies and
qualités,
gentlemen, in
il
your
est temps
various
maintenant de
rates and
conclure ce
qualities,
sommet et
we
je vais
now
essayer,
have to wind up
après les
the
discussions
summit,
d'hier,
and
le
having
dîner que nous avons
heard
eu et l'échange très fructueux qu'il y a eu ce
yesterday's
matin,
discussion, the dinner,
de
and
faire
this
une conclusion
morning's very
opérationnelle.
useful debates,
Parce
I'm
que
trying to
sinon nous nous quitterons sur des bonnes
produce what I
paroles.
would call an operational
Et il se
statement.
trouve que
Otherwise, it'll just be lip service.
moi aussi je
And
deviens vieux dans ce business.
I'm getting a bit old in this business too.
Et maintenant, par
And
nous-mêmes,
I
pratiquer
know that
l'indignation répétitive où on dit,
we end up
sommet après
practicing
sommet,
what we
il y en a
call
assez de parler,
repetitive
de faire des
indignation.
choses.
We all
On
say
arrive à avoir la
we've
même
talked enough
indignation,
after
mais
each summit, so we get
l'efficacité ne vaut que
wound
par le
up
suivi,
about it. But
par la
efficiency is seen
capacité à
in your
rendre compte
follow-up,
à
in
nos
the
sociétés
ability
civile, aux opinions publiques,
of,
et à
that
nous-mêmes
we
de
have
manière
to be
régulière. C'est pour ça que
accountable
je voulais tout à
to
l'heure que la
our
directrice générale du FMI
societies and as others. This is why I wanted to hear from the DG of the IMF to find out what's been done, because you can't just say nothing's been done. We're not going fast enough, we're not intense enough, and we need to go deeper and further. Okay, so what I will try to talk about some lines of action. What is our new consensus with respect to peoples and the planet? That's what we're talking about here. Firstly, I think we all agree, because this is what I've heard. I'm just the note taker, the scribe here. I think we all agree that the target is a world without poverty. We rightly got indignant about that. It was enough of inequalities. That's what, number 6, isn't it? Yes. Enough with inequalities. So let's get rid of poverty and preserve our planet. And we want a world where the most vulnerable countries are better equipped to deal with crises and climate change and conflicts. That's the Bridgetown agenda. So those are the consensus-based targets, and we have a clear strategy for that. We want to draw on all sources of funding, public development aid, and national resources, multilateral institutions, banks, and private funding. I think we all agree on that. Second big thing, in order to achieve these targets, what emerges from this, and I think this is what we're all illustrating, we have to stick together. There's a huge risk of institutions being fragmented. I think this was said yesterday. I think it was Nigeria at the meeting, at the dinner rather. So to avoid fragmentation, we have to have a deep reform of the governments of the international financial architecture to make it more efficient, effective, and more equitable, and better suited today's world. There's a full consensus there. We need to get down and work on that right away. Then there are 4 work streams I think we have identified. First, no country shall have to choose between combating poverty and protecting the planet. Secondly, the appropriation of transition strategies has to be done at country level. The different requirements, countries can follow their own paths, whether talking about energy, protecting forests, climate, nature, etc. Thirdly, we need a financing shock with more public funding, and also need more injection of private capital so as to transfer emerging and developing economies to take us to the targets of reducing equality and so saving our planet. In general terms, what we need is strong financial contributions, and there are some short-term solutions identified, in addition to what we've heard from Senegal and Zambia that say they're national successors. And I'm saying this for Anna because this has now been put down in writing. We have achieved the 100 billion SDR target. So the Paris call of 2 years ago, because we've seen from the follow-up, has now been materialized by a formal commitment. So it's either 100 billion SDRs or budget equivalents for those who didn't want to do it for whatever reason, for the most vulnerable countries, in particular in Africa. As of now, we have 61 billions in the IMF, and we're now going to, over the next few months, keep working to ensure that the remaining 30 new, where commitments have been made, actually reach people's coffers. Projects have been negotiated Several dozen others will be completed in the next few weeks. We're going to set up a framework so that we can use these SDRs or equivalents to reinforce the equity of regional development banks. So that's a task we'll be working on to make sure this can be allocated to the development banks, which will make everything more efficient and effective. And this will change people's lives. Fourth thing that we've noted progress on, although it's not sufficient, I agree. Our experts are telling us that as of now, we are getting close to 100 billion funding for the climate, the result of the Paris Agreement. And we've been much slower there, much less effective than with the SDR allocations. So we need much closer, more hands-on operational follow-up to this 100 billion for the climate, because where we are at the moment is not satisfactory. And I suggest we ask for a special report over and above any statement made for COP28 at the end of the year. Third thing, to be more effective, we have a consensus to say that each dollar lent by MDBs should be accompanied by at least the same amount of private funding. On that basis, we're expecting 100 billion in private funds mobilized each year in emerging and developing countries. Maybe we're more ambitious. We were saying it's simply so we can go on, but this at least has to be locked in. Fourth, short-term agreement area, we expect an overall increase of $200 billion lending capacity of MDBs, as said by Secretary Allen just now, over the next few years. That's a result of all the work that's been done working with institutions, optimizing our balance sheets, and we have decided that we all want that now. And we know that the multilateral banks will probably be able to lend more on that basis. This means that we're going to launch a monitoring exercise with the sort of infrastructure both that the South African Premier said, so that key infrastructure projects in Africa can be implemented, and that will be part of our follow-up. Fifth short-term target will be speeding up debt processing in the common framework we've decided. This was done for Chad a couple of years ago, for Zambia yesterday, and I'd like to thank you for raising this today. We will speed up the tackling of the debt problem. For Ghana and other countries, for example, we see that we have to provide mutual support when we're hit by a catastrophe. So we'll set up special tools, including a climate-resistant debt clause. So there's an agreement for all countries that will join the consensus that there should be what's requested in the Bridgetown agenda, make sure that multilateral banks can include that in their statutes. And of course, we call for two actions to be mobilized, two forms of coordination. The Climate Club that Chancellor Scholz mentioned in the framework of the OECD to coordinate countries' efforts with respect to climate and climate financing. And yesterday, we started the Finance in Common network with all the public development banks and MDBs that will enable us to coordinate. And then finally, other things will be done in cooperation with the chairs of G20 and COP. And I'll just go through the list so that we can remember what was said yesterday evening and today. New ideas for international taxation in those sectors that are benefiting most from globalization to respect our commitments and step up the fight against poverty and protecting the planet. So we will try to improve the most concessionary lending from the World Bank. Thirdly, inclusion of climate vulnerability in debt viability assessment by IMF and World Bank so that we can better take into account the need to combat climate change. Then we will reduce excessive risks, in particular exchange risks, as emerged in various roundtables. Then a new international funding facility for forests will be set up so as to pay for ecosystem processes so that we can help the countries concerned. What that means is a nature fund, which is to be finalized at COP at the end of the year. and we'll need that we'll be able to support countries when they work for their biodiversity, for countries like Gabon, Indonesia, Brazil, Cambodia, and others, in order to protect their biodiversity and protect their natural resources as we go forward. And then sixth point is that we will set up a working mechanism so as to make the most of raw materials extracted from developing and emerging economy countries so that we can have a value chain that will create jobs and increase GDP in the countries in those areas of the competence. And we commit to taking forward the work we've done with health and food so to reinforce countries' sovereignty. In March 2020, I'm sure Cyril remembers, this is why we set up the ACTA initiative with Tedros and the African Union, and then G20. And this meant that we could develop common resources for Africa, and then with Cyril and William's predecessor in Kenya, we worked on vaccine production capacity in Africa. It's 20% of the need, but 2% of the production, so we need to do more. And we've tried to increase vaccine production in Africa, as was said, the same with agricultural capabilities and fertilizers, but we need infrastructure in all countries that can build value chains in their special areas. And as requested by President Akufo-Addo, we will have a monitoring system involving the African Union in all the areas that they want to cover all the commitments made today. So what I've said here will be circulated among all of you. All of those who wish to formally sign up to it will be able to do so. So I'm the notary of this, if you like. If you don't want to take it as is, can add some things. But I think we need to shape a new consensus for our peoples and planet. We should have a report every 6 months, taking into account public opinion and the views of young people. And you know, there's a lot of contribution from CSOs, and we will have a proper monitoring system for them. And we want a 6-monthly report. And what I suggest is that on the way to COP, to be organized by Lula, and next year, you'll have presidency of GT at the Amazonian COP. We will do things, and we hope, and we have to have 2 years from now a meeting to review all of that. I think it's important to have commitments. Well, I'm as energetic as you, but we also have to be able to take stock of what we've done and see why we haven't achieved everything. I think it's a very pragmatic and perhaps rather plodding method, but it's the only way that we can be held fully accountable. A lot has been said. I hope I've covered everything, including the expectations of President Sisi. So we have a new consensus now, and I hope all of you here will sign up to that because it's ours. I have just spelt it out for you because I took the notes and I'm explaining what I think we agreed. And I hope on the basis of today's consensus, we can transform lives, help countries improve, and use our indignation to make sure that people's lives can change. Thank you all, and let's go for it because we're all committed to this. Thank you so much.
How are you?
Yeah, we'll C'est un honneur pour nous d'accueillir ce sommet pour un nouveau pacte financier mondial.
As you are considering a new finance pact, let's put people above profit.
And Emmanuel, I've left you for last because privately I call this the How Dare You Summit. How dare you? How dare you upset the order? How dare you step out of your crease and summon us all to this inflection moment? There is now the beginning of the understanding that poverty and climate cannot be separated. That education and climate cannot be separated.
En 2023, plus de 750 millions de personnes ne mangent pas à leur faim. Et des dizaines de millions de personnes supplémentaires sont en train de basculer dans l'extrême pauvreté.
For Kenya, for example, we pay $10 billion every year to service our debts. If I had $10 billion every year for development in Kenya, instead of paying debt, it would make a huge difference.
Les propositions qui nous ont été données, c'était des maturités de crédit faibles, des taux d'intérêt élevés, 12%. Il a fallu qu'on donne des garanties personnelles. Dans des cas comme ça, nous donnons des garanties immobilières. C'est-à-dire, si le projet ne marche pas, on est mis dehors.
Il y a 4 éléments très simples que je voulais poser en début de cette conférence. D'abord, le premier principe, c'est que jamais aucun décideur, aucun pays ne doit avoir à choisir entre la réduction de la pauvreté et la protection de la planète. Deuxième principe, chaque pays doit choisir souverainement son chemin. Troisième principe, nous devons assumer un choc de financement public. Et puis le quatrième principe, c'est qu'on a besoin de beaucoup plus de secteur privé.
Our job is to eliminate poverty, but on a livable planet. Today, we are announcing a comprehensive approach that significantly expands the World Bank's toolkit for crisis preparedness, response, and recovery.
This is my announcement. We have reached 100 billion on lending of SDRs. That was our target from 21. We have achieved that target.
Unless and until we come out with a fair, equitable, and judicious formula of distribution of resources, financial resources, this world will never live in peace.
I am pleased that the principle of solidarity expressed in Hiroshima resonates at this summit meeting in Paris.
We argue, and you will know strongly, that we now need a universal vulnerability index. We've had 100 years to do this. we now have 10.
Notre défi est de développer des marchés de crédit pour la biodiversité qui peuvent soutenir les peuples et la planète.
Now we have concessional for vulnerable middle income.
I'm determined that we do it by giving them quality of life and giving them jobs, because it is the best way to drive a nail into the coffin of poverty. That's the only way.
That we'll be announcing $50 million in new investments for the Blue Orchard Latin American Caribbean Gender Diversity and Inclusion Fund.
MDBs are leveraging machines. So let me end here with a call for us, the MDBs, to work together to scale this type of instrument, which is a very pragmatic, palpable thing to do.
But I think it's really important to know that nature and climate are not two separate things. Mother Nature, Mother Earth didn't create all this list of acronyms. It doesn't recognize them. It sees nature, including climate, as one ecosystem.
So we're actually thinking about how do those who are impacted and affected by crisis play a bigger role in actually determining the types of funding they need and the locations that it needs to go to.
Les trois sujets, écologie, sociale et démocratie, sont trois sujets intimement liés si on veut avoir des solutions efficaces.
We are saying we want one that does not bring the baggage and the toxic conversation of North versus South. We do not want a conversation that is going to take us to developing versus developed, emitters versus non-emitters. No.
We find the performance of bank accounts where women have been given assistance are actually doing very well. They never become non-performing assets.
So in all these systems of architecture, we're not just now talking about the needs on climate and the needs on development, but how do you pull women in, not just to the conversation, but to change policies?
Nous allons signer aujourd'hui, en tout cas nous venons d'avoir un accord avec le G7 à travers le JETP, Just Energy for Transition, où le Sénégal s'est engagé à monter à 40% d'énergie renouvelable à l'horizon 2030.
So by and large, the message from the African continent is now clear. We're on board, okay? We want to join the international community. We don't want Africa to be left behind.
For us to be successful in what President Macron wants to do here, we have to have regulators in the room. So here we are, touché.
We are determined to engage with all stakeholders and all market participants to make sure that private capital can be mobilized to fund low-income countries and especially to support them in the energy transition.
In the Global South, we have a lot of money available, and in the Global South, we have a lot of projects which need finance. So it's our goal is to bring together those two parties, right?
So let's be imaginative. Let's build a task force that can look at all these financial possibilities, these sources, whether it is a tax on transaction, on the financial transaction.
Let us agree to pay the aviation tax. We have no problem. Let us agree on the shipping tax, and we want to pay. We don't want anybody to pay for us. We want to pay our percentage.
I wanted to propose is that we look at global carbon pricing, because that could, of course, generate much, much more funding. Only 4%, only 4%, it's almost nothing. But these 4% have already generated last year $55 billion.
Voy a poner el Fondo de Clima como institución, que ha sido hasta ahora raquítico. Unos ingresos adicionales que tendrían que salir como una taxación a las transacciones financieras mundiales.
In March in Gabon, we had the pleasure of joining President Macron, the Rob Walton Foundation, in announcing a seed fund of $100 million just to get started, to jumpstart this process.
Il faut donc faire profiter des pays comme le Niger des instruments de garantie de financement auxquels nous pouvons prétendre et réduire les primes de risque excessives.
Les prochains mois qui seront marqués par des rendez-vous internationaux, c'est l'occasion pas simplement d'être d'accord sur un constat, mais sur des actions à entreprendre pour tenter de modifier la manière dont on se comporte, la manière dont on agit.
So my expectation is that we will agree in Paris and we will conclude in Nairobi.
The people of the world are watching what you do here. Please remember the people, we, the people.
you.